Some roads shouldn't exist, but they call to you anyway when the fog rolls thick across Ohio's forgotten highways. The darkness beyond Route 22 held secrets that would make seasoned officers question everything they thought they knew about the thin line between law and chaos, between the living world and whatever waits beyond it. Tonight I'm going to tell you about Officer Jake Morrison, a man who served his community faithfully for 8 years, until one November evening when he took a detour that led straight into the bowels of hell itself. This story will challenge everything you believe about reality, about death, and about the roads we travel when we think nobody's watching. You might want to lock your doors and check your mirrors more often after hearing this one. If you've ever felt that chill of being watched while driving alone at night, you'll understand why Jake's story will haunt you long after the last word is spoken. The fog that night was so thick you could taste the metal in it, and Jake Morrison had been patrolling the same stretch of Route 22 for 3 hours when dispatch crackled through with a domestic disturbance call on Oakwood Street. He'd driven these roads thousands of times, could navigate them blindfolded, but the fog made everything look different, made familiar landmarks vanish into gray nothingness. If you're listening to this while the sun is setting, take a moment to comment below with your local time and where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how many of you are brave enough to listen to this in the dark. The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller. Tonight has a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. Here's your question. What happens when a police radio receives calls from the dead? But let me ask you something else first. Have you ever noticed how some roads seem to whisper your name when you're driving alone? Now begins the tale of Jake Morrison and the night everything he understood about reality crumbled. Like old pavement, under the weight of something far darker than any crime he'd ever investigated. Jake had always been the kind of cop who followed protocol, the type who memorized every street in his sector and prided himself on knowing the quickest route to any address in 3 counties. His patrol car was immaculate, his uniform pressed, his service weapon cleaned and maintained religiously. At 32, he'd seen his share of domestic violence calls, drunk drivers, and petty theft, but nothing that shook his fundamental belief that the world operated according to certain immutable laws. The radio crackled with static as he acknowledged the call, the familiar voice of dispatcher Sarah Chen cutting through the interference. Unit 47. Respond to 1247 Oakwood Street, domestic disturbance, possible assault in progress. Jake flicked on his emergency lights and pressed the accelerator. But as he approached the intersection where he should have turned left onto Maple Avenue, the fog seemed to thicken impossibly, creating a wall of gray so dense his headlights couldn't penetrate it. The GPS on his dashboard flickered and died, the screen going black for a moment before displaying a message he'd never seen before. Recalculating route to destination unknown, he cursed under his breath and took what he thought was a familiar right turn, but the road that stretched ahead of him was not Maple Avenue. It was a narrow, cracked asphalt path that seemed to absorb his headlights rather than reflect them. The yellow lines were faded to the point of being barely visible, and on either side of the road, twisted trees leaned inward, like arthritic fingers trying to touch overhead. Jake reached for his radio to inform dispatch he'd taken a wrong turn, and would be delayed. But when he pressed the transmit button, only static answered him. His cell phone showed no signal, and the fog pressed against his windshield like something alive, something that wanted in. The town appeared suddenly through the fog like a photograph developing in slow motion. Buildings materializing from gray, nothingness with an unsettling wrongness that made Jake's stomach clench. Perdition announced itself with a weathered sign that looked like it had been standing for decades, the paint peeling away to reveal rust-colored metal beneath that reminded him uncomfortably of dried blood. The streetlights flickered with an irregular rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat, casting pools of sickly yellow illumination that revealed more shadows than they banished. Jake slowed his patrol car to a crawl as he entered what appeared to be the main street, his training, telling him to observe and assess, but his instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The buildings lined up in neat rows like any small Ohio town, complete with a barbershop, a diner, and what looked like a general store. But the windows were all dark, except for a few that glowed with an amber light that seemed to move and pulse. like candle flames in a breeze that didn't exist. As he drove deeper into perdition, Jake noticed the residents for the first time. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. They walked the sidewalks with a strange, stuttering gait, as if they were marionettes being operated by someone who hadn't quite mastered the strings. Their movements too sharp at the joints, too fluid in places where humans should be rigid. A woman in a 1950s dress stood beneath a streetlight, her head turned at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck, watching his patrol car with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. An elderly man sat on a park bench, his body facing forward but his head twisted completely around to track Jake's progress down the street, smile splitting his face that was far too wide for human anatomy. Children played hopscotch on the sidewalk, but their games seemed to involve jumping over cracks that opened and closed in the concrete like hungry mouths. And when one of them looked up at Jake's car, he saw that her face was a smooth expanse of skin with no features at all. The fog seemed thinner here in the town center, but it clung to the edges of buildings and pooled in doorways like something substantial, something that might grab at you if you ventured too close. Jake's radio crackled with interference, and for a moment he thought he heard Sarah's voice trying to reach him, but the words were distorted, stretched out like they were coming from very far away or from someone speaking underwater. He pulled over beside what looked like a normal fire hydrant, except it was painted black instead of red, and seemed to be leaking something dark that wasn't water. And tried his radio again. "Unit 47 to dispatch," he said into the microphone. His voice steadier than he felt. "I've encountered some kind of atmospheric disturbance and need assistance with location verification." The static that answered him was different this time. Almost musical, like voices singing in harmony but too low to make out the words, and underneath it, he could swear he heard the sound of footsteps on gravel getting closer to his car. The static from Jake's radio evolved into something that defied explanation, transforming from white noise into what sounded like dozens of conversations, happening simultaneously in a language he almost but not quite understood. The voices seemed to be coming from different decades, some speaking with the crisp diction of 1940s radio announcers, while others carried the casual slang of more recent times. But all of them shared an underlying quality that made the hair on his arm stand up. They sounded desperate, pleading, as if they were calling for help from somewhere very far away. Jake adjusted the frequency dial, hoping to find a clear channel back to his department, but every station he tried brought only more of the ghostly chatter, and gradually he began to pick out fragments of what they were saying. "Unit 23 requesting backup at the intersection of Nowhere and Never." One voice crackled through the speaker, followed immediately by another. "Dispatch. This is car 7. I'm lost on a road that doesn't exist and my compass is spinning like a carnival. Ride." The dashboard lights in Jake's patrol car began to flicker in sequence, first the speedometer dying completely, then the fuel gauge dropping to empty despite the fact that he'd filled the tank at the start of his shift. His headlights dimmed and brightened rhythmically, as if the car itself was trying to communicate in some kind of electrical Morse code. And when he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he noticed that his face appeared slightly blurred around the edges, as if the fog outside was somehow seeping into the vehicle and affecting everything it touched. The GPS screen that had shown the cryptic message earlier now displayed a map that made no sense, showing streets that curved back on themselves in impossible spirals and intersections, where 6 or 7 roads met at angles that hurt to look at directly. Jake pressed the power button to shut off the GPS, but instead of going dark, the screen flickered and showed him a bird's-eye view of his own patrol car sitting in the street of perdition, except in the image he could see himself from above. And there was something else in the passenger seat beside him, a dark shape that hadn't been there moments before. He whipped his head around to look, but the passenger seat was empty, just cracked vinyl and the smell of old cigarettes that he'd never noticed before. When he looked back at the GPS screen, it now showed a countdown timer that read 11 hours, 47 minutes, and 32 seconds, and was decreasing second by second, though he had no idea what would happen when it reached 0. His radio suddenly burst to life with perfect clarity, Sarah's voice cutting through as if she were sitting right beside him. "Jake, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours. Your last known position was on Route 22, but that was 4 hours ago, and we're showing you is off the grid." Jake grabbed the microphone so quickly he nearly dropped it, his hands shaking as he pressed the transmit button. "Sarah, this is Unit 47. I'm in some kind of town called Perdition. My equipment is malfunctioning, and I need immediate assistance. Send backup to my location." The silence that followed lasted so long he thought the connection had been lost, but then Sarah's voice came back. It was different somehow, colder, with an echo that made it sound like she was speaking from inside. A metal container. "Jake," Sarah's voice said slowly, "there is no town called Perdition in our jurisdiction. And according to our records, Officer Jake Morrison died in a single vehicle accident on Route 22 at 11:47 p.m. The sound of knuckles rapping against Jake's driver's side window cut through the radio static like a blade. And when he turned to look, he found himself staring into the face of a man who wore a sheriff's uniform that looked like it had been pressed yesterday but belonged to a decade that had ended long ago. The sheriff was impossibly tall, his frame filling the entire window from top to bottom. His skin had the waxy pallor of someone who hadn't seen genuine sunlight in years. What made Jake's breath catch in his throat wasn't the man's height or his unsettling appearance. His hands, they were positioned backwards on his wrists, palms facing outward when they should have faced inward, fingers bending in directions that defied human anatomy as he gestured for Jake to roll down the window. "Evening, Officer Morrison," the sheriff said, his voice carrying clearly through the glass despite its thickness. His backwards hands folded neatly behind his back in a posture that looked almost normal until you really focused on it. "I'm Sheriff Blackwood, and I've been expecting you for some time now." Jake hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to put the car in drive and floor it. But something about the sheriff's presence seemed to paralyze his decision-making process, as if the man's very existence was somehow draining the will from his body. Against his better judgment, Jake rolled down the window just far enough to speak, keeping one hand on the gear shift and the other near his service weapon. "I seem to have taken a wrong turn," Jake said, his voice sounding thin and uncertain in the fog-thick air. "I need to get back to Route 22. I have a call to respond to." Sheriff Blackwood's smile revealed teeth that were perfectly straight and white, but somehow too numerous for his mouth, as if he had extra rows of them like a shark. "Oh, you're exactly where you need to be, Officer Morrison," the sheriff replied, leaning down so his face was level with the window, and Jake could see that his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion, like looking into two holes that had been drilled straight through his skull. "We've been having some trouble with our night shift coverage lately, and a man of your experience and dedication is exactly what Perdition needs." Jake tried to start his engine, but when he turned the key, nothing happened, not even the clicking sound of a dead battery, just absolute silence, as if the car had forgotten how to be a machine. The sheriff reached through the window with one of his backwards hands and gently but firmly grasped Jake's wrist. And where his fingers touched, Jake's skin went completely numb. "Don't you worry about that domestic disturbance call, Sheriff." Blackwood continued conversationally, his grip tightening imperceptibly. "We called that in ourselves to get you here. Had to make sure you took the wrong turn at the right time. You see, Perdition operates on a very specific schedule, and we need officers who understand the importance of maintaining order, even when that order exists outside the normal laws of physics and human comprehension." Sheriff's backwards hands moved with disturbing grace as he opened Jake's car door from the outside, the handle turning smoothly, despite the fact that Jake was certain he'd locked the vehicle. "Step out of the car, Officer Morrison," Sheriff Blackwood said, and Jake found his body obeying even as his mind rebelled against the command. "We have a patrol route that needs covering, and the residents of Perdition are counting on your protection. In service, just like they always have, just like they always will." Jake's legs moved without his conscious permission, carrying him out of the patrol car and onto the cracked sidewalk of Perdition's main street, where the very air seemed to hum with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Sheriff Blackwood gestured with one of his backwards hands toward a path that led deeper into the town, past buildings that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when Jake wasn't looking directly at them, their windows changing positions like eyes that blinked too slowly. "For human perception, the patrol route is quite simple," the sheriff explained as they walked, his reversed palms clasped behind his back in that unnaturally perfect posture. You'll find that the streets of perdition follow their own logic, and the residents have needs. That differs somewhat from what you might consider normal police work. Jake tried to speak, to protest, to demand an explanation. But his voice seemed to have abandoned him entirely, leaving only the sound of their footsteps, echoing off buildings that appeared to be made of stone and brick, but felt somehow insubstantial, as if they were elaborate stage sets that might collapse if touched too firmly. As they walked past the barber shop, Jake glimpsed through the window a barber working on a customer's hair. But the customer's head was completely severed from his body and sitting on the counter while the barber carefully trimmed around the neck stump with scissors that gleamed like surgical instruments. The customer was apparently engaged in animated conversation, his mouth moving soundlessly while his body sat perfectly upright in the chair, hands folded in his lap as if waiting patiently for the service to be completed. At the diner, patrons sat at tables eating meals that steamed and moved on their plates, forks and knives cutting into things that bled colors that didn't exist in nature, while a waitress with too many arms served coffee from a pot that never seemed to empty despite pouring continuously. The general store's windows displayed merchandise that hurt to look at directly, objects that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once, their shadows falling in directions that contradicted the streetlights above. Sheriff Blackwood stopped in front of a building that Jake was certain hadn't been there moments before. A structure that appeared to be built from compressed darkness and reflected no light whatsoever, despite being surrounded by the town's sickly illumination. "This is our first stop," the sheriff announced, producing a set of keys that jangled with a sound like breaking glass. "Mrs. Henderson has been having some trouble with her basement again, and she's requested police assistance with what she calls an infestation problem." Jake found his voice returning just enough to whisper a single word. "What?" Sheriff Blackwood's shark-toothed smile widened impossibly, his backwards hands fumbling with the keys in a way that suggested he was still getting used to their reversed orientation. "Oh, you'll understand soon enough, Officer Morrison," he replied, selecting a key that appeared to be made of crystallized shadow. "The thing about police work in perdition is that the crimes here aren't quite the same as what you're used to handling burglary. Assault, domestic disturbance, those are all surface problems for surface people living in surface reality. Here, we deal with infractions against the natural order itself, violations of the fundamental laws that keep existence from unraveling completely." He inserted the shadow key into a lock that Jake could have sworn wasn't there a second ago. The door swung open to reveal not the interior of a building, but a staircase that descended far deeper than the structure could possibly contain, disappearing into darkness so complete it seemed to actively repel the feeble light from the street. Mrs. Henderson stood at the bottom of the impossible staircase, and Jake's mind struggled to process what he was seeing as they descended into the basement that couldn't exist within the laws of physics he thought he understood. She wore a floral print dress that might have been fashionable in the 1960s. Her gray hair perfectly curled and set, but her skin had the translucent quality of old parchment, and her movements carried the stuttering, mechanical rhythm he'd noticed in the other residents of perdition. "Officer Morrison," she said in a voice that sounded like it was being played through a gramophone with a worn needle. "I'm so glad Sheriff Blackwood brought you to help with my little problem." Jake tried to focus on her face, but it kept shifting, slightly, as if he were looking at her through water that was never quite still, and when she smiled, her teeth appeared to be made of tiny, perfect pearls that clicked together when she spoke. The basement itself defied every architectural principle Jake had ever encountered, stretching away in all directions far beyond what the building above could contain. Its walls lined with shelves that held jars filled with things that moved in the amber liquid, things that looked almost but not quite like organs he might recognize. Mrs. Henderson led them past rows of these specimens, her heels clicking on a floor that seemed to be made of polished bone, while she chattered pleasantly about the weather, and how nice it was to finally have proper police representation in the neighborhood again. "The infestation is in the far corner," she explained, pointing toward a section of the basement where the walls appeared to curve away into infinity, "and I simply cannot get them to stay put where they belong." Sheriff Blackwood nodded knowingly and placed one of his backwards hands on Jake's shoulder, the touch sending waves of numbness down his arm. Mrs. Henderson here died in a car accident on Highway 35 back in 1967. The sheriff explained matter-of-factly, but she's never quite accepted the situation and keeps trying to maintain her normal daily routine. The problem is that her routine involves keeping house, and in her current state, her definition of housekeeping has become somewhat ... expanded. Jake followed their gaze to the corner. Mrs. Henderson had indicated and felt his sanity slip another notch as he saw what she was talking about, dozens of translucent figures moving in repetitive patterns. Ghostly forms that appeared to be trapped in loops of mundane activities. A man mowing a lawn that didn't exist. A woman hanging. Laundry on lines that disappeared into the ceiling. Children playing hopscotch on courts marked out in what looked like chalk made of ground bone. They're supposed to stay organized by decade, Mrs. Henderson continued, wringing her hands in obvious distress, but they keep wandering into each other's time periods, and it creates such confusion. The 1940s housewives keep trying to teach the 1980s children their games. And the men from the 1950s don't understand why the more recent arrivals dress so strangely. Sheriff Blackwood handed Jake a clipboard that materialized in his backwards grasp, and Jake saw that it held what appeared to be citations written in a language that hurt his eyes to read. Your job, Officer Morrison, is to issue violations to any spirits who are outside their designated temporal zones and escort them back to their proper decades. Jake stared at the clipboard, then at the ghostly figures continuing their endless routines in the corner, then back at Mrs. Henderson's expectant face. This is insane, he managed to whisper, but even as he spoke the words, he found himself walking toward the corner with the clipboard in his hands, his body once again moving without his conscious permission. Mrs. Henderson clapped her pearl-toothed hands together in delight. "Oh, wonderful!" she exclaimed. "It's been so long since we've had proper law enforcement down here to keep things tidy." Sheriff Blackwood's backwards hands guided Jake through a door behind Mrs. Henderson's basement that opened directly into what appeared to be a police station, complete with booking desks, filing cabinets, and a row of holding cells that stretched far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with the same irregular rhythm as the streetlights outside, casting everything in harsh intermittent illumination that made Jake's shadow dance independently of his movements. "Welcome to the Perdition Police Department," the sheriff announced, with obvious pride, his shark teeth gleaming in the unstable light. "We've been operating continuously since 1923, when the first officer took a wrong turn and discovered our little community. I think you'll find our facilities are quite adequate for the unique challenges of law enforcement in a jurisdiction that exists between the spaces of normal reality." Jake's eyes adjusted to the lighting, and he began to make out details that chilled him to the bone. The booking desks were occupied by officers in uniforms from different eras, some wearing the high-collared tunics of early 20th century police, while others sported more modern tactical gear. But all of them shared the same waxy pallor and mechanical movements he'd observed in the town's residents. Behind the booking desks, he could see into the holding cells, and what he saw there made his knees nearly buckle. Each cell contained a police officer in various states of uniform, some still wearing their badges and equipment belts, others stripped down to their undershirts, but all of them staring straight ahead with expressions of absolute despair that never changed. Never blinked, never showed any sign of life beyond the minimal rise and fall of their chests. "Officer Patterson here joined us in 1967, Sheriff Blackwood said conversationally, stopping in front of a cell that held a man who couldn't have been more than 25 years old despite having supposedly been there for decades. He was responding to a disturbance call in Toledo when he took a detour through some construction and ended up on our welcoming roads. Officer Martinez arrived just last year from Columbus, and Officer Thompson has been with us since the 1980s. A drunk driving incident that led to a very fortunate navigational error from our perspective." The sheriff's backwards hands moved along the cell bars as he spoke, and Jake noticed that each cell door bore a small placard with the officer's name, badge number, and the date they'd arrived in Perdition. But no date of departure because there never was one. "These men serve as our emergency reserves," the sheriff explained. "Should we ever need additional manpower for larger disturbances?" Though they've found their enthusiasm for active duty has somewhat diminished over the years, Jake tried to step backward to put distance between himself and the horrific sight, but found that his feet were rooted to the floor as if they'd been glued there. One of the imprisoned officers, a young woman with sergeant's stripes on her sleeves, slowly turned her head to look directly at him, and when their eyes met, she mouthed a single word: "Run." Sheriff Blackwood noticed the exchange and chuckled. A sound like grinding glass. "Oh, Sergeant Williams is always trying to frighten the new recruits," he said dismissively. "She's been with us since 1995 and still hasn't accepted that her previous life ended when her patrol car skidded off Interstate 76 during that ice storm. The beauty of our system here is that death is really more of a career change than an ending. You get to continue serving and protecting, just with a slightly different understanding of what those terms mean." Jake felt something cold and metallic being pressed into his palm and looked down to see that Sheriff Blackwood had placed a badge there. Tarnished silver with numbers that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking at them directly. "This is your badge now, Officer Morrison?" the sheriff said, his black eyes reflecting nothing. "Badge number 47. Just like your old patrol unit, we like to maintain continuity where possible to help with the transition." The radio mounted on the station's front desk crackled to life with a cacophony of voices that seemed to be calling from across decades, each transmission overlapping with the others in a symphony of desperation that filled the police station with sounds no living person was meant to hear. Jake listened in growing horror as dispatcher voices from different eras announced calls that painted a timeline of tragedy stretching back nearly a century of Ohio. Law enforcement. "Unit 12. We have reports of a disturbance at the old Blackwood farm," came a tinny voice that sounded like it was being transmitted through equipment from the 1940s, followed immediately by a more modern-sounding dispatcher. "All units. Officer down on Route 23 need immediate backup," and then another voice, crackling with the static of even older technology. "This is Central. We've lost contact with Officer O'Malley. Last seen investigating reports of strange lights near the covered bridge." Sheriff Blackwood moved to the radio with his backwards hands and began adjusting dials that Jake was certain hadn't been there moments before, fine-tuning the chaos into something approaching organized madness. "These are all the officers who've joined our ranks over the years," the sheriff explained, his voice carrying a note of what might have been pride or nostalgia. "They're still out there on patrol in their own way, responding to calls that come from places that exist in the spaces between what people call reality. Officer Morrison, you'll be pleased to know that your old dispatcher, Sarah Chen, has been trying to reach you for the past several hours' time. Works differently here. You understand, and she's been increasingly concerned about your welfare." Jake grabbed the microphone with shaking hands, desperate to re-establish contact with the world he understood, the world where physics made sense and dead people stayed dead. "Sarah, this is Jake," he said, his voice cracking with strain. "I need immediate backup at these coordinates. I'm being held against my will by some kind of..." The radio speaker exploded with Sarah's voice, but it was wrong somehow, distorted, and echoing as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Jake, where are you? We found your patrol car wrapped around a tree on Route 22. You've been unconscious for hours. The paramedics are working on you, but your vital signs are getting weaker. Please hold on. Please don't leave us." Sheriff Blackwood reached over with one backwards hand and gently took the microphone from Jake's grasp, his touch sending waves of cold numbness up Jake's arm. "I'm afraid Miss Chen is experiencing some confusion about your current status," the sheriff said kindly, like a doctor delivering bad news to a family member. "You see, the accident she's referring to did occur, and your physical body is indeed in quite serious condition. But your consciousness, your essential self, arrived here in perdition exactly when it was supposed to." Jake stared at the radio in dawning comprehension as more voices continued to pour through the speaker, each one telling variations of the same story. Officers who died in the line of duty, dispatchers reporting accidents and casualties, families being notified of losses that stretched back through decades of service and sacrifice. The radio calls weren't coming from the living world at all, they were echoes, reverberations of the moments when each officer's life had ended and their service in perdition had begun. "Your old life is over, Officer Morrison," Sheriff Blackwood continued, his black eyes boring into Jake's soul. "But your new life, your eternal life of service to the residents of perdition, is just beginning." The sheriff gestured toward the holding cells where the other officers sat in their endless vigil. They all went through this same realization, this same moment of understanding when they discovered that death was simply a transfer to a different Precinct 1, with different rules and different crimes to investigate, but the same fundamental duty to serve and protect. Sheriff Blackwood led Jake to a filing cabinet that appeared to be made of the same compressed darkness as some of the buildings in perdition. Its drawers labeled with years that seemed to shift and blur when he tried to focus on them directly. The sheriff's backwards hands moved with practiced efficiency as he pulled open drawer after drawer, revealing manila folders stuffed with documents that rustled like dried leaves despite looking like ordinary paperwork. "Every accident, every wrong turn, every officer who's ever joined our ranks," the sheriff explained as he rifled through the files. "We keep meticulous records of their arrivals and their eventual acceptance of their new duties." Jake watched in mounting dread as Sheriff Blackwood located a thick folder near the back of one drawer. Ow! A folder that bore Jake's name in handwriting that looked suspiciously like his own, despite the fact that he was certain he'd never written it. "Here we are," the sheriff said with satisfaction, spreading the contents of the folder across a desk that materialized from the shadows. "Officer Jake Morrison, badge number 47, 8 years of exemplary service with the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Expected time of arrival in perdition, November 15th at 11:47 p.m. Jake stared at the document spread before him and felt reality fracture a little more as he recognized official forms that detailed not just his career history, but his entire life from birth to the moment of his death, complete with photographs he'd never posed for showing him at various stages of his existence. There were incident reports describing his childhood accidents, his high school football injuries, his police academy training, and dozens of near misses throughout his career where death had brushed close but hadn't quite claimed him. The final document in the folder was a coroner's report, stamped and signed, describing the fatal injuries sustained when Patrol Unit 47 collided with a tree during fog-related visibility conditions on Route 22. The time of death officially recorded as 11:47 p.m. "The beautiful thing about our system," Sheriff Blackwood continued, his backwards hands carefully organizing the papers in chronological order, "is that we've been tracking potential recruits for decades before they actually arrive. Every close call, every moment when an officer almost didn't make it home, creates a small tear in the fabric between their world and ours. And we can see through those tears to identify the candidates who will eventually join our department." Jake's hands trembled as he picked up the coroner's report. Reading the clinical description of his own death, massive trauma to the head and chest, internal bleeding, loss of consciousness at the scene, followed by cardiac arrest during transport to the hospital. "The fog that night wasn't natural weather," the sheriff explained helpfully. "We generate it when we need to guide specific individuals to the roads that lead here. Think of it as our recruitment tool. Your dispatcher Sarah was quite right to be concerned. But what she doesn't understand is that your body's struggle to survive is just the final formality before your consciousness completes its journey to where it truly belongs." Sheriff Blackwood opened another drawer and produced a badge that was identical to the one Jake had worn in life, except this one was made of some material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He also pulled out a duty belt complete, with service weapon, handcuffs, and radio, all crafted from the same light-absorbing substance that made them appear to exist in a space slightly to the left of reality. "These are your new tools for your new jurisdiction," the sheriff said, laying them out on the desk like a priest preparing sacraments. "The crimes you'll be investigating are quite different from what you're used to: violations of the natural order, infractions against the laws of death and time, disturbances in the careful balance that keeps the living world separate from what lies beyond it." The clock on the station wall began to chime midnight. But instead of 12 strikes, it continued tolling endlessly as shadows gathered in the corners of the room and began to take the shape of men and women in police uniforms from every era of American law enforcement. Jake watched in paralyzed fascination as the spirits of dead officers materialized one by one. their forms becoming more solid with each chime of the impossible clock. Done. Until the station was filled with dozens of cops who had died in the line of duty across Ohio's blood-soaked highways. Sheriff Blackwood stood at attention beside his desk, his backwards hands clasped behind his back in perfect military posture. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had been conducting this ritual for nearly a century. "Roll call for the midnight shift," the sheriff announced, words echoing off walls that seemed to extend far beyond the station's physical boundaries. "Sound off when I call your name, and remember that your service continues regardless of your previous mortal status." The first name he called belonged to Officer Michael O'Malley, who had died in 1924 when his horse threw him during a pursuit of bootleggers through the back roads of rural Ohio. And when the ghostly figure stepped forward and responded, "Present, sir," his voice carried the accent and cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language in the tenements of Cleveland. Next came Officer Sarah Walsh, killed in 1943 when her patrol car was struck by a drunk driver while she was working a checkpoint during the rationing years, followed by Officer James Rodriguez, who had died in a shootout with bank robbers in 1967, and Officer Linda Thompson, who had been killed by a pipe bomb planted by anti-war protesters in 1971. Each name called forth another spirit. Another story of service cut short by violence, accident, or simple bad luck. And each officer responded with the same crisp "present, sir," that echoed through the station like a military funeral conducted in reverse. As the roll call continued, Jake began to notice that the officers weren't just from different eras, they were from different jurisdictions throughout Ohio. Spanning small-town sheriff's departments, big city police forces, state highway patrol, units and federal agencies, all of them united in death by their common service and their shared fate of taking wrong turns that led them to perdition. Sheriff Blackwood called out names that Jake recognized from newspaper headlines and police. Memorial Walls, Officer David Martinez, shot during a domestic violence call in Toledo in 1995. Detective Rebecca Foster, killed while investigating a serial killer in Cincinnati in 2001. Trooper William Hayes, struck by a drunk driver while assisting with a traffic accident on Interstate 75 in 2008. The list went on, each name representing not just a death, but a family destroyed, a community left to grieve, a hole torn in the fabric of the living world that could never be properly repaired. When Sheriff Blackwood finally reached the end of the roll, he turned to Jake with those black holes that served as his eyes and said, "And now we welcome our newest recruit, Officer Jake Morrison, badge number 47, who joined our ranks tonight." After 8 years of distinguished service with the Ohio State Highway Patrol, Jake found himself stepping forward despite every fiber of his being screaming at him to run, to fight, to resist the inexorable pull of this nightmare that had claimed his life and his identity. "Present, sir," he heard himself say, the words coming from his mouth without his permission, his voice joining the chorus of the dead in acknowledging his new status as a guardian of the space between life and whatever came after. Jake's legs carried him toward the station's exit without his conscious control, driven by some primal instinct to escape that overrode the supernatural compulsion that had been governing his actions. But when he pushed through the door he expected to lead to perdition's Main Street, he found himself standing right back inside the station lobby as if he'd walked through a revolving door that only rotated in one direction. He tried again, this time running full speed toward what he was certain was the door to the outside. But no matter which exit he chose, the front door, the back door, window he tried to climb through, he always ended up back in the same spot, facing Sheriff Blackwood's amused expression and the endless rows of filing cabinets that contained the death records of every officer who had ever tried to leave. "The beautiful thing about perdition," the sheriff explained as Jake stood there panting from his futile escape attempts, "is that it exists in a closed loop of space and time, which means that all roads, all paths, all attempts to leave this jurisdiction inevitably lead back to where you started. It's quite efficient from an administrative standpoint. Really, we never have to worry about officers calling in sick or requesting transfers to other departments." Jake stumbled back toward his patrol car, which sat exactly where he'd left it, on Perdition's Main Street, But when he reached for the door handle, he discovered that there was no door handle. No door at all, in fact, just smooth metal where the driver's side entrance should have been. He ran to the passenger side and found the same thing, a car that looked complete from the outside but had been sealed like a tomb, trapping whatever remained of his old life inside while leaving him stranded in this nightmare realm where the rules of physics bent to accommodate the whims of the dead. The windows of the patrol car showed his reflection, but it was wrong somehow, blurred around the edges like an old photograph that had been left in the sun too long. And when he pressed his hands against the glass, he could feel that his palms were becoming translucent, allowing the sickly streetlight to pass through his flesh, as if he were slowly fading from whatever remained of physical existence. Sheriff Blackwood appeared beside him with that unsettling silent movement that all the residents of Perdition seemed to share, his backwards hands resting on the car's roof with casual familiarity. "The vehicle serves as a sort of anchor," the sheriff explained, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher addressing a slow student. "It represents your connection to your old life, your old identity, your old understanding of how the world works. But like everything else from the living world, it becomes sealed off once you've fully accepted your new position here." Jake beat his fists against the car windows until his knuckles split and bled. But the glass remained perfectly intact, while his hands left no mark on the surface, as if he were already too insubstantial to affect the physical world in any meaningful way. The other officers went through this same process. Sheriff Blackwood continued conversationally. Some of them took days to accept their situation. Others took weeks. But eventually they all came to understand that fighting against their new circumstances only prolonged the adjustment period and made their eventual integration into our department more difficult than it needed to be. Jake could see his equipment still sitting inside the sealed car, his backup weapon, his radio, his clipboard, with the half-finished reports from his last living day, all of it tantalizingly close, but forever out of reach. Like looking at artifacts from a life that had belonged to someone else, someone who had existed in a world where cause and effect still functioned according to comprehensible rules. Sheriff Blackwood's form began to shift and blur in the sickly streetlight, his tall frame stretching even taller as his backwards hands twisted into positions that defied every rule of human anatomy. And when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath Perdition's cracked streets. "I suppose it's time you learn the truth about our little community." Officer Morrison, the sheriff said as his face elongated and his shark teeth multiplied into rows that filled his mouth like a lamprey's maw. "My name isn't really Blackwood, and I wasn't always the sheriff of this particular jurisdiction once upon a time. I was Officer Thomas Henley, badge number 1, the first highway patrolman in the great state of Ohio. And I died in 1923 when my motorcycle hit a patch of black ice. While pursuing a rum runner through these very roads," Jake watched in horror as the sheriff's uniform dissolved and reformed, cycling through different styles and eras like a time-lapse film of police fashion, finally settling on the he-collared, brass-buttoned tunic of a 1920s motorcycle cop, complete with jodhpurs and tall leather boots that gleamed with an oil-slick sheen. "When I died," the sheriff continued, his voice now carrying the flattened vowels of someone who had learned to speak in the early decades of the 20th century, "I found myself in a place that wasn't quite hell and wasn't quite purgatory, but something in between, a way station for those who had dedicated their lives to maintaining order in a world that was fundamentally chaotic and cruel." The other residents of Perdition began to gather around them as Sheriff Blackwood spoke, emerging from buildings and shadows like actors taking their positions for the final scene of a play. And Jake could see now that they were all wearing uniforms of one sort or another, not just police uniforms, but the clothing of every civil servant who had ever died while trying to maintain the thin veneer of civilization that kept society from devolving into complete anarchy. There were firefighters who had died in blazes that consumed entire city blocks, paramedics who had been killed while responding to calls in dangerous neighborhoods, postal workers who had frozen to death during blizzards while trying to deliver, the mail and sanitation workers who had been crushed by the very garbage trucks they operated in service to their communities. "We are the guardians of the spaces between life and death," Sheriff Blackwood explained, as his backwards hands gestured toward the assembled crowd of the eternally employed. Every society creates its own version of perdition, a place where those who served the public good in life can continue their work in death, maintaining the barriers that keep the living world from being overwhelmed by the chaos that lurks just beyond the edge of human perception. Jake realized with growing dread that this wasn't just a town or even just a supernatural prison. It was an entire ecosystem designed to process and utilize the souls of dead civil servants, turning their dedication to duty into a kind of spiritual fuel that powered whatever cosmic machinery kept the boundaries between dimensions intact. The sheriff's form continued to shift and change as he spoke, sometimes appearing as the 1920s motorcycle cop he claimed to have been, sometimes reverting to the backwards-handed figure Jake had first encountered, and sometimes taking on aspects of every officer who had ever died in Ohio, as if he were a composite entity made from the collective memories and experiences of nearly a century of law enforcement casualties. "We've been recruiting new officers for almost 100 years now," the sheriff said, his black eyes now multiplying across his face like a spider's compound vision. "And each new arrival brings fresh energy to our mission of maintaining order in the spaces where order shouldn't be able to exist at all." The truth hit Jake with the force of a head-on collision as fragments of memory began to surface through the supernatural fog that had been clouding his mind since his arrival in perdition. The feeling of his patrol car sliding on black ice, the sickening crunch of metal against wood as he struck the oak tree on Route 22, the taste of blood in his mouth as consciousness faded and the fog rolled in to claim what remained of his life. He had died hours ago, maybe days ago, time having no meaning in this place where the dead continued their endless shifts. And everything he had experienced since taking that wrong turn had been the process of his soul being processed and integrated into perdition's supernatural bureaucracy.
Atch!
Sheriff Blackwood nodded approvingly as understanding dawned in Jake's eyes, his composite face shifting through the features of every dead officer who had ever served under his command. "The accident was quite severe," the sheriff confirmed, his voice now a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "Your patrol car left the road at approximately 60 miles per hour and struck a tree with enough force to crush the entire front end, trapping you inside while the fog we generated prevented any other traffic from discovering the scene until it was far too late for medical intervention." Jake could remember it now, the desperate radio calls to dispatch as he felt his life slipping away, the paramedics working frantically to extract him from the wreckage, a helicopter ride to the trauma center where doctors fought to save a man who was already walking the streets of a town that existed between life and death. Sarah Chen's voice on the radio hadn't been coming from the living world at all. It had been the echo of his own memories, his dying brain's attempt to maintain some connection to the reality he was leaving behind. The dispatcher calls, the backup requests, the frantic attempts at communication had all been his subconscious mind's way of refusing to accept that his career, his life, his entire existence as Jake Morrison badge number 47 had ended when his skull cracked against the steering wheel and his heart stopped beating in the mangled ruins of what had once been a symbol of law and order. Every detail of perdition, from Mrs. Henderson's basement full of temporal refugees to the police station with its cells full of dead officers, had been constructed from his own knowledge and experience, his mind's way of creating a familiar framework for processing the incomprehensible reality of continued existence after death. The fog, the backwards-handed sheriff, the residents who moved like broken marionettes all of it, had emerged from the deepest parts of his psyche. The places where a cop stored all the weird calls, the unexplained incidents, the cases that never quite made sense but had to be filed away and forgotten in order to maintain sanity in a job that regularly exposed him to the worst aspects of human nature. Sheriff Blackwood's form stabilized into something that looked almost human, almost familiar, almost like Jake himself might look after spending decades patrolling the roads between life and death. "The beauty of our system," the sheriff said, his voice now sounding eerily similar to Jake's own, "is that each new officer brings their own understanding of duty and service to enhance our collective mission, creating a version of perdition that reflects their own experiences and expectations, while serving the greater purpose of maintaining order in the spaces where chaos reigns supreme." Jake felt the last remnants of his resistance crumbling as he accepted the truth of his situation. He was dead. Had been dead since the moment his car left the road. And everything that had happened since then had been his consciousness adapting to its new existence as a guardian of the boundaries between worlds, a cosmic police officer whose beat now extended far beyond the highways of Ohio, into realms where the very concept of law enforcement took on meanings that the living mind could never comprehend. Jake's eyes snapped open to the harsh white glare of hospital fluorescence, the steady beeping of monitors filling his ears as he tried to focus on the face of a nurse who was checking his foreline with practiced efficiency. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it made him dizzy. It had all been a hallucination. A nightmare brought on by head trauma and whatever cocktail of drugs they'd used to keep him alive during surgery. Miss Chen is outside waiting to see you, the nurse said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The doctor says you're lucky to be alive after that accident on Route 22. Most people don't walk away from crashes like that one. Jake tried to sit up, but found that his body felt strangely light, almost weightless, as if he were floating just slightly above the hospital bed rather than lying on it. When he looked down at his hands, they appeared normal at first glance. But when he moved them, the motion left brief afterimages in the air. Translucent copies of his fingers that lingered for just a moment too long before fading away. The nurse continued her work, adjusting his blankets and checking his chart. But Jake noticed that she never quite looked directly at him, her eyes always focusing on a point slightly to his left or right, as if she couldn't quite see where he actually was. Sada Chen entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the strained expression of someone who had been maintaining a vigil for hours. But when she spoke, her voice carried that same hollow quality Jake had heard on the radio in Perdition, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Jake, thank God you're awake," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "We were so worried when they found your car wrapped around that tree. You've been unconscious for almost 18 hours and the doctors weren't sure if you were going to make it." As Sarah spoke, Jake began to notice other details that made his relief curdle into fresh horror. The window in his hospital room showed not the familiar Cleveland skyline he expected, but the twisted buildings of Perdition stretching away into fog-shrouded distance. The other patients he could see in the hallway moved with that same stuttering mechanical gait he'd observed in the town's residence. And when he looked more carefully at Sarah's face, he could see that her features were slightly blurred around the edges, as if she were a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. The nurse who had been tending to him turned around, and Jake saw that her face was completely smooth, except for two black holes where her eyes should have been, the same empty sockets he'd seen in Sheriff Blackwood's skull. The hospital room began to shift and change around him, the walls stretching upward into impossible heights, while the floor seemed to drop away beneath his bed. And he realized with growing dread that this wasn't a rescue at all, it was just another layer of Perdition's elaborate illusion, another test to see how completely he would accept his new reality. Sarah reached out to take his hand, and where her fingers touched his skin, Jake felt the same cold numbness that had spread from Sheriff Blackwood's backwards grip. "You're going to be fine, Jake," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that belonged to no living human throat. "You're exactly where you belong now. It's exactly where you've always belonged, and we're going to take such good care of you." The hospital monitors continued their steady beeping, but Jake could see now that they weren't connected to him at all. The wires led away into shadows that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the room, disappearing into depths that had nothing to do with medical equipment and everything to do with the machinery that kept Perdition's supernatural systems functioning properly. Jake found himself back behind the wheel of Patrol Unit 47. The familiar weight of his duty belt around his waist, and the comforting presence of his radio crackling with dispatch calls as he drove the pre-dawn darkness of Route 22. The fog was rolling in thick from the east, reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead of his headlights. And he could hear Sarah Chen's voice cutting through the static with a domestic disturbance call on Oakwood Street. The déjà vu was so intense, it made his head throb, but he couldn't quite grasp why this moment felt so familiar. Why every detail from the cracked vinyl of his driver's seat to the particular way the fog swirled in his headlights seemed like something he'd experienced before in a dream he couldn't quite remember. He'd been patrolling the same stretch of highway for 3 hours when the call came in. And as he approached the intersection where he should have turned left onto Maple Avenue, he hesitated for just a moment, his hand hovering over the turn signal as some buried instinct whispered that he should take a different route tonight. The GPS on his dashboard flickered and went dark, displaying that same cryptic message he felt certain he'd seen before. Recalculating route to destination unknown. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself turning right onto a narrow road that seemed to absorb his headlights rather than reflect them. A path lined with twisted trees that leaned inward like arthritic fingers, reaching for something just beyond their grasp. His radio crackled with static as he tried to inform dispatch of his detour, but when he pressed the transmit button, only white noise answered him. And underneath the interference, he could swear he heard voices calling from very far away. Voices that sounded desperate and pleading and strangely familiar. The town of Perdition materialized from the fog exactly as it had before, its weathered welcome sign and flickering street lights casting the same sickly yellow glow over buildings that shifted and rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. Jake pulled his patrol car to a stop in the exact same spot where he'd parked during his previous visit to this impossible place. And as he sat there with the engine idling, he began to remember fragments of what had happened the last time he'd taken this wrong turn. Sheriff Blackwood with his backwards hands. It's a basement full of temporal refugees, the police station where dead officers continued their eternal shifts, and the horrible realization that he himself had died hours ago. In a car accident that his mind refused to accept. The passenger door of his patrol car opened, and Sheriff Blackwood slid into the seat beside him, his composite face cycling through the features of every dead officer who had ever served under his command, his black eyes multiplying and dividing like cells under a microscope. "Welcome back, Officer Morrison," the sheriff said, in that chorus of voices that belonged to a century of fallen cops. "Ready to begin your first official shift as a guardian of the roads between life and death?" Jake's hands moved without his conscious permission, reaching for his radio to acknowledge the domestic disturbance call that would lead him through this same sequence of events again, and again, and again, for all eternity. The loop was perfect, seamless, inescapably. Any time he died. Every time he accepted his fate. Every time he thought he might escape or wake up or return to the living world. He would find himself back at the beginning, taking the same wrong turn that led to the same destination, serving the same supernatural jurisdiction where duty never ended and the shift never quite came to a close. In the distance, he could hear the sound of another patrol car's engine growing closer. Another officer approaching the same intersection where they would have to choose between the safe route home and the road that led to perdition. And Jake knew that soon he would be the one standing beside that car with backwards hands and black eyes, welcoming the next recruit to their eternal department. If you're still listening to this in the dark, perhaps you should check your rearview mirror more carefully on your drive home tonight. Subscribe so the fog doesn't find you on your next wrong turn. And remember that some roads call your name for reasons you might not want to understand.